Go. Fantastic. Oh, I see some familiar faces. Good to see. Um, Faye, I'm going to let you kick things off. I can see room 5 is still connecting to audio. I'm not sure who
We'll
room
just give
5
them
is.
2 ticks to sign in and
Much better to say 2 ticks than 2 secs. A very, very funny
I
joke
shouldn't
about
laugh
a.
at that. It's not a bad
No,
joke.
no, it's a funny joke. It's a joke about it because this will let people connect up and things. Um, a little girl comes up to Dad and says, Dad, what's sex? And the dad's a bit, you imagine how. Well, I know how that feels. And anyway, he thinks, best thing to do, just be straightforward about it. So he went into the whole thing and explained it all and all the details about what's involved and even a couple of positions and things like that. And his daughter's face has just gone pale as he's explaining it. And he turns around and says, so, sweetheart, why did you ask? And she turns around and says, because Mum said dinner will be ready in 2 secs.
Okay, I get it. With that in mind, shall we kick off? I think room 5's still having problems with the audio by the looks of it.
Maybe. You can kick off, Faye.
Yeah. Okay. Kia ora, everyone. Nau mai, hoki mai, mo te atua whakarongo mai. Thanks for tuning in again. I'm delighted to welcome you all back to this third session, I think, James, now in this series of free webinars. James is obviously joining us again from his home in Melbourne, and we have the lovely Jane from Sydney. So welcome back, you two. We're really looking forward to hearing about all the mistakes we make, James, and maybe you can give us some tips on how we can avoid making them. So over to you now.
Thanks very much, Faye. Welcome back, everyone. It is good to see you all here again. And as Faye said, we're going to talk about mistakes because, oh man, we have been overrun with this social media thing about mistakes, celebrate mistakes and all the rest of it. And we just need to be clear. Oh, hello. Someone's still got their microphone on. Just be clearer about the way we use mistakes because, well, let's see. Well, I can still see you all. If I look over this way, I can see you. Just wave at me if you can remember a time when mistakes were bad. Who remembers that? Don't make mistakes, big red cross, feel guilty about it, all the rest of it. Who's now been jumping on the celebrate mistakes bandwagon? Mistakes are good. Everyone should make mistakes, encourage mistakes, that sort of stuff. There's a heap of that in social media these days. And I really don't want to encourage kids to make mistakes. Some of them are growing up to be pilots and surgeons, and when they're doing their job, I don't want mistakes at all. So we need to be a little bit clear about what we mean when we celebrate mistakes. In one of the earlier, one of the earlier sessions that we did, I talked about this diagram. Now, the vertical axis of this diagram is standard. You can think about it as year level or difficulty or complexity, but basically as you go up, it gets harder. And most of us have seen students and experienced ourselves progress look like this, that for a while it's easy, but then it gets harder and harder and progress slows down, and eventually we reach this place that Anders Ericsson calls a performance plateau. We all seen that? Yeah, it's perfectly normal part of learning. Now, this early part over here, where progress is quick, this is called our comfort zone. And our comfort zone is full of things that we find easy. It's full of things we've mastered a long time ago, but it's also full of things that I call easy things that you haven't done yet. Right? The world is full of easy things that you just haven't done yet. Most of you, if I asked you to do your 13 times tables, would say, I don't know how to do that. If I said you needed to learn them by this time tomorrow, you could say, all right, I'll know them by this time tomorrow. You've already got the skills and abilities, but you just haven't got around to learning it. And this, by the way, just as a little bit of a side note, this highlights one of the big misunderstandings about the comfort zone. We're always telling people to get outside your comfort zone, do something new. And those two things aren't the same. Doing something new and getting outside your comfort zone isn't the same thing. There are plenty of new things that are easy things you haven't done yet. Getting outside your comfort zone means, get the hand the right way, going this way, doing something more difficult. A lot of people spend their lives just doing new things, but they get to their 70s, 80s and 90s and they realize too late that that thing that was out of reach for them when they were 30 is still out of reach when they're 40, 50, 60. That they actually spent their whole life doing the easy things they hadn't done yet. Now this zone here, this is called our performance zone. This is when we're doing our best, our current best. This is when we bring all our abilities to bear, all our most concentration and so forth to produce our best current performance. And there's times when you need to do that. Right now, for me, this is a performance situation. I'm bringing to bear, believe it or not, my best skills and abilities to try and communicate these ideas to you, which is great. That's exactly what you want me to do. You want me to be at my best. You don't want me going, oh yeah, look, you know, this is pretty easy for me. No, you want me at my best, but you don't want me beyond my best. Beyond your best is just up here, which is where we call our learning zone. That's that zone of proximal development that you might have heard of. That's that little bit of stretch, not strain. It's that thing that feels 7 out of 10 uncomfortable, not 10 out of 10 uncomfortable, but 7 out of 10 uncomfortable. And if you're in the first session with me back in February or March, this might be familiar to you. We talked about this when we started talking about the challenge pits. And this area right up here, this is our aspirational zone. This is when that stretch becomes a strain. It's well beyond our current best, and it's not possible for us to achieve that in one go. Now, bringing this attention back to our consciousness, because identifying when we're in our comfort zone, when we're in our performance zone, when we're in our learning zone, and when we're in our aspirational zone makes all the difference when we start talking about mistakes. Because mistakes made down here are very different to the sorts of mistakes we make up here. And the responses we should have to those mistakes are very, very different. Now, the trouble with that diagram, of course, is that, or that idea, is that when we go beyond our best, when we stretch ourselves beyond our current best, we get worse. You can't just do better than your best. If you could do better than your best, we would call it your best. But because it's beyond our current best, our standard is going to decline briefly and we're going to make mistakes. And that's where these sort of ideas have come in. You know, you jump onto social media and you know, Pinterest. You've heard me talk about Pinterest before, I'm sure. I mean, why would you bother with rigorous intellectual thought when you have the wisdom of Pinterest? But this idea that every mistake you make is progress is the sort of idea you get a lot of on social media. But when was the last time you handed back a piece of work to a student that was full of mistakes and you said, great progress, well done? You see, it's not the mistakes that are the progress. And what about these sort of ideas? I'm a big fan of the Khan Academy, but failing, just another word for growing. No, it's not. Failing is a word to show growth has not taken place. It's a word to show that here is an opportunity to grow. It might even be here is a need to grow, but it's not the growth. See, many of us, this is all wrong. Many of us grew up in that period where we were discouraged from making mistakes. We were told we had to get it right. And that backfired. That led us to stay in our performance zones and in our comfort zones where we weren't likely to make mistakes. When we realized we had that message wrong, that it shouldn't be about don't make mistakes, that we actually need to go into our learning zone and make mistakes, the pendulum swung the other way. The pendulum said, well, if your mistakes aren't bad, then they must be good. And mistakes aren't good either. Mistakes aren't good and they aren't bad. All they are sources of information. Let's do some corrections here. Every mistake you make is not progress. It's every mistake we correct that is progress. And that idea that we often say, mistakes help you learn. No, they don't. It's what we do with mistakes that help us learn. And one of the features of what we're going to be talking about today is that I want us to focus less on the mistake and more on the action, the verb. I keep coming back to verbs in all the work I do. It's about what the student does in response to the mistake. These ideas, mistakes teach you important lessons. We all know someone who has made some really significant mistakes in their life and completely failed to learn from them. It's not the mistake that teaches you the important lesson. It's how you respond to that mistake that teaches you. I said before, failing is not a word for growing. Failing is a word to show you need to grow. And by the way, I'll give you this. So I haven't given it to Jane, so she can't drop it in I don't think you've got a copy of it. Have you, Jane, this diagram? No, I don't think so. We'll send a copy of this image to you as well. This last one, every mistake you make is progress, or every mistake you make, you're one step closer to your goal. We often hear this one associated with Edison, the 9,999 light globes that didn't work. What we've got to appreciate about Edison and this idea about making mistakes is that Edison wasn't making any old mistake. He wasn't just trying this and that didn't work, trying this, that didn't work. Mistakes like that don't get you closer to your goal. What Edison was doing is he was making very, very deliberate mistakes. He was using the scientific method to create mistakes that gave him the most possible information. And it's those design mistakes that we're going to be talking about in just a little while, because the value in a mistake is not the mistake. The value is how much information can we extract from that mistake. We get posters like this. I love this poster. Mistakes are proof that you are trying. Isn't that lovely? Great. You tell the kids, well, at least you're trying hard. No, thank you very much. It's correcting mistakes that are proof that you are growing. And it's that idea that there's a verb involved, correcting, and that the result is the growing. I'm not interested in you made a mistake, at least you're trying. I'm interested in that you're correcting that mistake, and that shows me that you're growing. And so can you see I'm starting to change the narrative a little bit about the way we talk about mistakes? And as I said before, those mistakes aren't good or bad. We shouldn't be stigmatizing them. We shouldn't be saying they're bad. In some situations we might. But in a normal course of things, we shouldn't be saying the mistake is good either. What we need to be focused on is what the student does and what the student is capable of doing in response to that mistake. And to help you do that, I want to talk now about different types of mistakes. And by the way, I can't see the chat. Jane will let me know if there's a chat. If you've got any questions, throw things in the chat box as we go. I think in classrooms, and certainly in my classroom, when I had a classroom, when I had my own students, I think we often talk about mistakes as if they're just one thing. It's just not getting something right. But when we look at mistakes through the lens of how much information can we get from it, how does it contribute to the learning process, we recognize mistakes aren't one thing. In fact, there's at least 6 different sorts of mistakes. And the first mistake is what I call a confusion mistake. Who's made a mistake in their life where they've done something and it gives you no idea what went wrong? You're sitting there just going, I don't get it. And it leaves you confused. It leaves you befuddled. It leaves you very unsure about what's going on. Now, if you're having those emotions, confusion, befuddled, unsure, if you can't see any useful information in the mistake you just made, it's not helpful at all. And the response to making that sort of mistake should be, can't do this, I need some help. Like, there's no point in, if you're that confused, to keep on going with it. There's one time when you make these sort of mistakes. These sort of mistakes happen in your aspirational zone. They're so far beyond your current best that you just can't work out what information is being presented to you. And the one time you'd want to make these sort of mistakes is when you're doing something that I call a moonshot. Sometimes you have a crack at things, like you give it a go, just knowing you're going to fail, right? You know it's well beyond your current standard, but you're not quite sure how far beyond your current standard. You'll try the hard question. You'll do the more difficult task, knowing that you can't do it, but wondering if you'll get close. Like, is that within reach? And I'll give you an example. You might not know this guy. Andrew Gaze is a basketball player here in Australia. He was the Australian captain for many, many years. And he was a figure in basketball while I was growing up and I was playing basketball. And, you know, clearly he's the Australian captain. He's much, much better than I was. I was never anywhere close to that standard. But I had the opportunity to go to a coaching clinic with him one day. And so I'd spent the afternoon, you know, being taught by Andrew Gaze and a bunch of other players. And at the end of the day, there was the opportunity to have a one-on-one with Andrew Gaze. Now, he's the Australian captain. Okay, so let's be clear about this. I had no illusions that I was going to be able to beat him. But I wondered, how can I get around him? Can I get one shot off? So just to be clear about this, the only time I touched the ball was when he gave it to me. Like, the standard he was at, I had no appreciation of just how good he actually was. I couldn't get my hand close to the ball while he was dribbling. I couldn't hold on to the ball for more than 2 or 3 seconds while he just took it off me at will. That sort of mistake, I didn't learn anything other than his standard is way, way beyond my current standard. So these confusion mistakes, they happen in our aspirational zone. They don't give us information that is useful helping us to improve. The one time you might use them is when you're deliberately trying something too hard just to find out how close to that standard you are. Then there are these sorts of mistakes. These are what I call the sloppy or the careless mistakes, the mistakes that make you go, oh! Who's made these mistakes? No, we've all made these mistakes. You know, you forget to charge your phone overnight, or you forget to put the computer on before you start the presentation, or, you know, silly things. These are mistakes that happen in your comfort zone. Now, because they happen in your comfort zone, they're well within your current abilities. They're not offering you any new information. Sure, they might act as a reminder, but they're not helping you grow in any way. These are the sorts of mistakes that when we celebrate mistakes in the classrooms, when we say things like, you know, everyone makes mistakes, and then students make these sorts of mistakes, they go, oh, mistakes are all right, everyone makes mistakes. No, they're not. These mistakes shouldn't be made. They are the result of a lack of focus, a lack of attention, a lack of care, and we really shouldn't be making them. When we find ourselves making these careless mistakes, we need to revisit the standards, make sure we know what we're trying to aim for. And sometimes we can turn the mistake itself into what I call a design mistake, which I'll talk about at the very end. But trying to work out, why did I make that mistake? For example, and I can't do it because it's plugged in, I made a careless mistake a couple of weeks ago. You know, I obviously, travel around Australia, New Zealand internationally, not so much in the last 12, 18 months, but as a rule, I do a lot of travel. And when I travel, I know I pack up my computer, I put all my bits and bibs and bobs and stuff in my bag, and I check it all and I go. Now, last time I had to do that was 12 or 18 months ago. And then I had to do it again just recently, my first interstate trip about a month ago. And so I packed up on my computer and I said, I can do all this, click, click, click. Now it's a new computer. My old computer had a HDMI cable that I just plugged into it. This computer needs an adapter. Guess what I forgot? I forgot the adapter. Now, that was just a careless mistake. I should have been in my routine of check, 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 make sure I've got it all, but it was careless that I didn't do it. The only learning that came out of that experience was I've got a new computer. I need to put an extra step in my mental checklist to make sure I take the adapter for the monitor. Really, well within my current abilities, maybe there was a little bit of learning. But as a rule, when students are making these mistakes, these careless mistakes, they should be told off. You shouldn't be making these mistakes. These mistakes are not to be encouraged. Then there are these mistakes. The mistakes that make you go, oh, wish I hadn't done that. Yeah, these are performance mistakes. These are mistakes that happen when you're at your best. These are the mistakes that happen in high stakes situations. These are the mistakes I alluded to before, that some of our students are growing up to be pilots and surgeons, and we don't want to encourage them to make mistakes. The thing about these mistakes is that this is exactly the sort of mistake that many students fear. All right, when you talk about students who don't want to make mistakes, that want to be perfectionists, that want to get things right, it's these mistakes that they fear. And that is exactly the way it should be. We should be fearful of these mistakes. We should be doing everything we possibly can to reduce the likelihood of these sorts of mistakes being made. The trouble with these sorts of mistakes for those students is that they think every situation is a performance situation. The mistake, if you like, that they're making is failing to identify when it's right not to make mistakes and when it should be an opportunity to make mistakes that we're about to talk about. So in performance situations, the key here for the student is to know that right now is a time when I shouldn't be making mistakes. Right now is a time when I should stay within my current abilities. It's a time when I want to minimize the chances of making mistakes. It's a time when I should be putting in checking strategies. I should be, doing all those things that help me eliminate mistakes. And it's about recognizing that now is an appropriate time to do that. But not every time is an appropriate time to do that. I'm going to do some parent workshops in another month or two. I'm working with a expert in the United States around parenting, and she's got a lot of her parents that have kids that are perfectionists, that don't want to make mistakes. And the message, or one of the key messages we're sending there, is that those students, those ones that don't want to make mistakes, always want to get it right, that's to be encouraged. But we do want them to go outside their learning zone, outside their performance zone rather. So what we need to do is to encourage that idea of wanting to do things right, because that's a good quality, do things right. But at the same time, we want to encourage them to understand that the learning process involves times, not all the time, but times when they should go beyond their current best. And the mistake they are making is not being effective learners. Because effective learners go beyond their performance plateau. They stretch and challenge themselves. And they make these next three types of mistakes. The mistakes we've just spoken about, the confusion mistake, the sloppy or careless mistake, and this performance mistake, not helpful to the learning process. The three sorts of mistakes that are helpful to the learning process start with these sorts of mistakes. Sometimes stuff just happens. Who's had that moment where you were doing something, perhaps you're tapping away on the computer, and suddenly something happened, your picture was reformatted or it went to the right place and you went, oh, that's how it works. Fantastic. Who's had that sort of moment? Or perhaps you went home, you're a scientist, you were growing bacteria, which you do, because that's what you do. You're growing bacteria on the Petri dish and you just left it on your windowsill. And you came back on Monday morning and there was mold on your Petri dish. And rather than throw it out, you looked at it and went, that mold's killed the bacteria. That's really interesting. And we'd call you Mr. Fleming and you'd have just discovered penicillin. He wasn't looking for it, but the information presented itself. And these are those aha moment mistakes, those mistakes that light you up, that give you some moment of intrigue or spontaneity about it. Now, we can create these mistakes in classrooms, and we often do when we talk about play-based learning. Like particularly with very young students, early primary students, and we talk about play-based learning, we're not really saying just go and play and do anything. We're setting them up to make these sort of aha moment discoveries. These are the times when we sit the kids down and say, oh yeah, look, go play with those batteries and the wire and the globe and just see what happens. And they work out for themselves by accident, by mistake, that when you connect it up the right way, the light globe goes on and they go, wow. And those mistakes are beautiful. They're memorable, which really helps. But one of the things about them is they're easily forgotten. You lose track of them. So one of the lessons we need to help students understand about these aha moments is to recognize what an aha moment mistake is. That moment we go, oh, yeah, great. To go, yeah, that's fantastic. And then repeat it. Write it down, interrogate it, investigate it, work out why. How many times have you had an aha moment mistake? And for me, it's with software. Like I play around with my technology a lot and I try to work things out. And every now and then I'll go, oh, that wasn't what I was trying to do, but that's really cool. Like I'll have to remember that. And guess how often I remember it? So when you do that, when you have those aha moment mistakes, when the cake bakes the right way, when the computer turns itself on, all that stuff, recognize that this is one of those moments where suddenly I have some useful information. Don't just move on and go, oh, now it works. You've got to capture that information. And so speaking about this in terms of, that idea I said before about mistakes are only as useful as the information they give you to help you grow. The risk with an aha moment mistake is that you let go of that information. It was there, but then you don't bother to actually capture it. So the key here is to make sure we capture that information. The next sort of mistake is the mistake that we often want students to make. When we talk about encouraging mistakes, it's these mistakes that we're interested in, these stretch mistakes. Stretch mistakes are mistakes that we make deliberately. And when I say deliberately, I mean they're the mistakes that we make because we deliberately go into our learning zone. We deliberately go beyond our current best, just a little bit, stretch, not strain, 7 out of 10 uncomfortable, not 10 out of 10 uncomfortable. But we deliberately go there knowing that things are going to go wrong and therefore being prepared to capture that information when it happens. And not just capture it in the way that we do an aha moment, because in an aha moment, the information presents itself. In a stretch mistake, we've got to go digging for it. We've got to say, that's wrong, that's right. How do I get from there to there? What's the process? What's the gap? What's the bit between where I'm aiming for and where I've got? So with stretch mistakes, the intention here is to know that they're going to happen. Remember our students that were fearful of mistakes? They make a mistake when they're fearful of these sorts of mistakes. These sorts of mistakes they should be embracing, not because there's a mistake, but because those mistakes can be interrogated. You can mine that mistake for the information. And again, it's about the information. What are we doing with the information? Can we find the information to tell us how to get from the thing that's not right to the thing that's right? And most of the time in the classroom, when we're in learning situations, not when we're in performance situations, but when we're in learning situations, it's these mistakes that we want to encourage. It's these mistakes that all the banners and the signs that said celebrate mistakes and we make great mistakes, all that sort of stuff was really aimed at these sorts of mistakes, not the confusion mistakes or the performance mistakes or the sloppy mistakes. It's these mistakes that we meant when we said celebrate mistakes. But again, and I said this before, don't celebrate the mistake. The mistake itself isn't important. Celebrate that the student has stretched themselves into their learning zone. That's an important action that they've taken. Celebrate their 3, 4, 5 attempts to try and interrogate that mistake. But the work's not finished until the mistake is corrected. The process of learning, very broadly summarised, is stretch, correct, repeat. Stretch into your learning zone, make the mistake, correct it, raise your standard. Repeat, stretch, correct, repeat. And it's typically these sorts of mistakes that in many situations in the classroom we're aiming for. The final mistake is this one that I talked about earlier on, these design mistakes. These are the mistakes that we make very, very deliberately, and we do it searching for particular information. When we make stretch mistakes, it's like we're going mining, let's go see what we can find. Excuse me. But these stretch mistakes, we're looking for something very, very specific. It's Edison controlling all the other variables and just changing the filament width by 1 millimeter. That'd be a lot, but that idea, and getting the most possible information. Other stuff can happen. Sometimes you can get an aha moment mistake along the way, but they're hard to create deliberately when we're looking for genuinely new information. It's these if then. And again, maybe it's my technology bias, but I find when I'm learning something new in a bit of software that I make these if then mistakes all the time. I deliberately go out and test. Will it work if I do this? No, that doesn't work. Stop trying with that menu item. Does this work? No, stop using that menu item. Does this work? That gave me something, and I work through it. Gamers. Now, we talk about how kids are prepared to make lots of mistakes when they're doing gaming. Gamers make these sorts of mistakes all the time. They know because they're going to get another go, they'll get another life, that they'll stick their head around that corner, boom, all right, the head's got blown off, won't do that again. Let's go the other corner. And they're testing, measuring all the time for specific information. And that idea that when we're very, very focused on the information that we get from mistakes, that we can start designing mistakes shows a maturity for the student about what they're doing with the mistake. Now, we've got a couple of posters where we summarise these mistakes. Boys and girls, and Learning Network New Zealand has copies of these to print or give away or something. Faye will remind me what we did with those, but I know that we've passed them on to Learning Network, so you can get them from there. But the intent of these images are to help students recognise that mistakes aren't mistakes. They're not one category. Mistakes are useful to the learning process if they're above the line, if they're aha moment mistakes, if they're stretch mistakes, or if they're design mistakes. But they're not particularly useful if they're confusion mistakes, sloppy mistakes, or performance mistakes. We make a mistake when we avoid all mistakes. But we also make a mistake when we say, everyone makes mistakes, it's okay to make mistakes. The key is to recognise where we are making those mistakes. Are we making them in a comfort zone where we should know better? Are we making them in a performance zone where there's probably negative consequences for making them? Are we making them in our aspirational zone and by stretching too far, not getting much information about how to move forward? Or are we making them in our learning zone? Are they aha moments where we suddenly stumble across information? Are they stretch mistakes where we have to interrogate the mistake to find the information? Or are they design mistakes where we deliberately go looking for that information? And so recognizing that mistakes aren't mistakes helps clarify what the role of mistakes in the learning process actually is. We got girls, we got boys. And that brings me to another point that, and if you've got questions about any of this, drop them in the chat. Jane will let me know there's a chat there for me to look at, and we'll sort of go from there. But I'll wrap up in the next 5 or 10 minutes as we go through this. Understanding the role of mistakes in the learning process helps make your students better learners. A big part of my work at the moment is around teaching students how to engage in the learning process. It's a term I'm calling learnership. Like we could talk about craftsmanship and we talk about leadership as a skillful exercise. I think we need to stop talking about learning as a one-dimensional thing and talk about learnership as a skillful process. And skillful learners understand the different roles mistakes play. They do something similar with feedback. Learners that aren't very skillful will ignore feedback or only respond to the feedback that they already knew was right, the positive affirmations. But as you get above the line, learners will start to do what they're told. You give them a mistake, and you to give the feedback, do this to fix it, they'll do it. But better learners, self-directed, independent learners, will actually interrogate that mistake for themselves. And better learners again, we're talking about feedback now. Better learners again will go and look for that feedback, will come and ask you for it rather than wait for it to be given. And the most developed learners, the most skillful learners, will be the ones that will tailor their feedback. I was working with and I'll explain that term. I was working with a school here in Sydney a few weeks back, and we were talking about how we wanted the students to be more skillful learners. And we were talking about design mistakes and those sort of things. And we said for the feedback part, it's another way of gathering information. Feedback and mistakes are very, very similar in that they're both sources of information. And what we said that we wanted the students to do is that students should have a purpose for learning that they should be aware of. So at the start of an assignment they're about to hand in, we wanted these girls, it was a girls' school, to write down, this is the information I'm going to need at the end of this assignment. I'm working specifically on these skills, because it might be different for different students. And that's what I need feedback on. They do the assignment focusing on those specific, learning outcomes that they're looking for. And then the teacher knows to not just give feedback, the things they recognize, but to give feedback that is tailored to what the student needs. And that idea that just like design mistakes can produce the information you're looking for, tailoring feedback requests the information you specifically need. And I'll give you one more example of that because it's a little bit of a new idea to some people. I was actually in New Zealand and I did a keynote presentation over there for the Principals Association or Primary Principals Association in Wellington. And the person emceeing the event was one of the ex-presidents or past presidents of the Australian Speakers Association. Very, very skilled speaker. And at the time, I'd just been awarded what they call a CSP, a Certified Speaking Professional. Doesn't mean anything to you, but it just meant I was up a notch in the speaking business. Anyway, I missed an opportunity to tailor feedback. There was a specific part of my speaking that I was trying to work on, which was my stage presence, where I stood on stage and those sorts of things. And I should really do it like this, so just to illustrate the point. That I should have asked him for the feedback. What I did was instead I went up, did my show, went really well. Then after the show, I said, great to meet you. Can you tell me a little bit about my stage presence? And he went, "Oh, James, I wasn't really paying attention. I noticed a few things wrong with your slides, and a few things you could do better. All these things that I didn't need to know about. That wasn't what I was focusing on. I was focusing on my movement. And I missed the opportunity to gather the information from one of the few people in the room that was capable of giving me the information I needed, because I didn't ask for it first. I didn't tailor the feedback to suit my specific needs." So you see how I move around there? Have to do it that way on the camera. So that's what I mean by tailoring feedback. And that idea of being a skillful learner is a key part of this idea of learner agency. Faye's going to talk to you in a minute and mention that I'm doing some workshops around learner agency. But Jane's also going to drop this document. It's about a 28-page document that I've written around the idea of learner agency. And I know in New Zealand, you're doing a lot of work around this. A lot of people talk about learner agency as being voice and choice. And that interpretation, as I explain in this document, is pretty shallow. It involves more than just giving students the opportunity to choose things and to say things. There are two other elements that I talk about. One is the growth mindset side of it, that you've got to understand that your actions can make a difference. And the second is that if you're going to take on challenges beyond your current best, that you need to develop this idea of learnership. So Jane has, or will shortly, drop this into the chat box for you to download. And I invite you to have a look at the learnership matrix that I've put in there and to think about how I bring those ideas of the environment to act, the will to act, and the power to act, which is about the school, it's about your mindset, and it's about learnership. That actually gives students the capacity to exercise real agency in their world. This is the way I define it, that learner agency is the degree to which an individual is able to take initiative to meaningfully influence their world, particularly in the face of challenges. I think we forget that part. We often forget that it's not meant to be easy things they could already choose. It's meant to be difficult things. It involves the interrelated and equally important elements of the environment, the school, the will to act, the mindset, and the power to act, which is this idea of learnership. So hopefully that'll give you a bit of a sense of why we're talking about this idea of mistakes. It's not just a random idea that I think is nice. It fits into this bigger picture of teaching students how to be skillful learners. And that idea, I think, is critical, because I don't know about you, but I know for myself and for many teachers that I work with, we go home exhausted. I mean, who goes home exhausted after work? Not because you've been busy. I mean, we're all busy, but because you spent all day dragging students through the learning process. It's like you do all the hard work for them. Skillful learners, go down the bottom. Learners that lack learnership waste their time and energy. Mid-range ones spend their time and energy, but they sort of exchange it with you. So they're sucking the energy out of you when they waste it. They exchange it with you when they spend it. But skillful learners invest their time and energy, and they actually give energy back to the room. When you're a skillful learner and you don't need to have everything corrected for you, you don't have to have every challenge identified for you. When you know what to do with that mistake, when you can tailor feedback, then learners are not only more effective, more skillful, learning more, but they give energy back to you to spend in other ways. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm sure Faye, who's about to come back on, if she'll flick her camera on, there she is about to tell you a little bit about as well. Thanks, Faye.
Oh, thanks. Namhi nui ki a koe, James. Thank you. Lots of food for thought and stretching of our thinking around this. I think these webinars have been a great taster for what we can expect when you're actually here in person. So we're looking forward to welcoming you back to our shores here in New Zealand in August 9th to the 12th. And for everyone out there, just the info about all these sessions is actually on the Learning Network website. So we hope some of you are able to make it to these sessions. They're being held in Auckland. And it'll be great to hear James live, face to face, in the same room, where you can have those kind of those powerful conversations and connections that are missing through these Zoom sessions. But really looking forward to that, James. So yeah, it's not that far away. So let's hope our bubble stays open. Everyone out there, thank you for tuning in. I know it's hard at the end of a busy day, but I hope you go away with some good thinking around this, and have a fabulous week. Mā te wā.
Thanks, Faye. And as always, I'll hang around for a few minutes if there are people who have got questions that want to ask stuff. So cool. Otherwise, go home to your loved ones. Thanks, folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
There we go. And I'll just because I know you're doing this, I'll just